Hello and welcome to the Northeast Grazing and Livestock Conference. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, the National Grazing Lands Coalition, American Farmland Trust, Farm Credit East, Morrison Custom Feeds, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. Please take a moment to visit their virtual booths for more information about their work. I'd also like to thank our partners, the Cedar Tree Foundation and the Forest C and Francis H. Latner Foundation. They help make our work possible throughout the year. The entire New England Grazing Network would like to thank you for your participation in our first annual Northeast Grazing and Livestock Conference. Enjoy the conference.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. Happy to help moderate this discussion. And just to start off, encourage your questions because we really want to drive everyone's interest in the direction that this whole thing goes. So we're calling this session 50 Shades of Grays. Credit to whoever came up with that. Pretty clever. And I think it's fun to think about just diving into like one aspect of, I'm sure, a lot of conversations we could have around our grazing systems. But what we'll do first is just some brief hellos from the panelists, and then we'll get a little bit deeper into the types of ways that each of us is working with shade, and then open it up to Q&A at that point. So Brett, you want to go first and say hello?
Morning, everyone. I'm Brett Chedzoy. I live in Watkins Glen, New York. I work for Cornell Cooperative Extension as a regional extension forester, and our family has a grass-fed beef operation, which we'll tell you about a little bit later.
Great. Tyler, you want to say hi?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Tyler Brennan, and I am currently with American Farmland Trust as a land protection project manager. Formerly, I've been working on farms from Maryland, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. Live in Maine currently, and have some pretty cool experiences with different types of shade units. So happy to be here. Thank you.
Cool, great. And Phelan?
Yeah, hello, everyone. My name is Phelan O'Connor. I run Pigasus Meats on the Champlain Islands of Vermont. We are a pastured egg operation in addition to a pastured pork producer. We previously had been focusing on feeder pigs, but now are transitioning to do a little more with farrowing as well on our farm.
Great. And I'm Steve Gabriel, Wellspring Forest Farm in central New York, pretty close to Brett. And we're mostly working these days with pastured sheep and doing a lot with silvopasture, which we'll talk about a little bit. And wrote a book about silvopasture a few years back, mostly trying to pull together what's out there in terms of current knowledge and identify the gaps in that interesting practice. So happy to talk about that if there's interest. So let's get a little deeper here. I think the context for this conversation comes most directly from, I think, any livestock grazer's experience, where if there is a tree and it is a hot day, livestock will often seek that. And I've driven by many places where that lone tree in the pasture has been trampled literally to death over years or decades, because the animals want to be there, and the accumulation of hooves and weight and trampling and manure and all that over time can tend to be really stressful on these trees. So shade is something that the animals are often telling us is of their interest, and that's what I always come back to, is our observation as grazers and the importance of that. There's sort of this research and I guess a debate in a sense, at least from a scientific perspective, about can you quantify the benefits of shade? And a lot of research has been done more in the confinement sort of feedlot scenarios, which are often in really hot, dry climates, and the animals don't have a lot of mobility, which is not really the context of this conference, but we can certainly deduce some of the measured benefits from that kind of extreme scenario and extrapolate that out into more pasture-based systems. But there's a lot of good information out there. One article I'd definitely recommend is on the AFTA, Association for Temperate Agroforestry website, if you want to Google that and read up and get some of the background. But we're here to really hear from folks' experience and share perspectives on how shade has come to find value in a grazing system and what different ways folks are working with shade. So we're going to just roll through everybody here and just hear a little more detail about the ways that's playing out on these different farms. So Brett, you want to start?
Thanks, Steve. The shade on our farm is almost entirely provided by trees. And as Steve just noted, any day that it's warm out, you see grazing animals actively seeking out shade. Really, in my observation, anytime it gets above the mid 60s, animals, and it doesn't matter really what type of livestock or what color they are, actively seeking shade. So we farm here in the Northeast, and we have lots of trees on our farm. I think some of our other panelists today are going to illustrate why they had to bring in other types of shade because they didn't have lots of trees on their farm. But we're always looking to utilize those trees in a way that's beneficial to both the animals and the trees to provide shade. Our farm name, as this slide says there, is Angus Glen Farms. And our just tell you a little bit about what we do. We're about 100 cow-calf operation. We graze about 500 acres, about half of that is in silvopasture. We have both what we call our wood silvopastures as well as plantation silvopastures. And the farm is owned and operated by our family, my wife Maria and I and our 3 adult children. We also have a large ranching operation in central Argentina where Maria's from, and the silvopasture and the shade is even more important there, but that's a different story for a different time. That's all I have to say at this point, Steve. I guess you want me to say something about living barns too. So we see our trees not only as useful for shade in the warmer parts of the year, but also during the cold times of the year for shelter. And this is a term that has been used for a long time. I'm not sure where it really originated. I heard Troy and Brian talking about it in the opening session this morning. So we get extended use out of our tree areas, but our living barns are managed specifically for winter shelter, not necessarily so much for forage production as silvopastures. This is a picture during a winter storm last winter where the cows rode out several days of ugly weather, snug as bugs and rugs. They had water and were able to get out of the extreme stuff, and we stocked them up with hay. But unlike a classic barn, we don't use these throughout the winter. We only use them when we really need them. So we can talk about that later in the questions.
Great, thanks, Brett. Tyler, you want to share a little about shade experience in your grazing? You're muted.
Sorry, I don't know why that didn't click right off. Yeah, thanks, Steve. So what you're looking at here is called the Shade Haven. This was a pretty nifty contraption that comes out of Wisconsin. I was fortunate enough to go, kind of work with this all the way from initial conversations of getting it delivered to daily use and upkeep and even some modifications. I think the first thing to say about this is this specific device is extremely simple to use. I chucked my father-in-law in this picture, who's never been around cows. He's never driven one of those machines, so I kind of wanted to just show how anyone can do it. So this was great for this particular farm. which is in the south coast of Massachusetts. It was the tallest elevation in the town, about a mile from the ocean. So as you can imagine, the wind was pretty intense, and there's just not a lot of tree coverage on this specific spot. So we really needed to have something to be able to move the cows once, twice a day. You could expand or break down this to move it in a matter of 60 to 90 seconds. Sometimes, on probably 80% of the time, I'm not even collapsing the umbrella. I'm really just destabilizing it, hooking it up to the UTV and pulling it, wherever I need to go. The cows absolutely love this thing. It had a scratcher on it, had an oiler on it. I put a mineral bucket on there. As you can see, they're chewing their cud there, or they're coming and going. They're not always underneath it. It's really just using it when they need it. And kind of multiple benefits of this anyway is they flock to it. So we had to cross the road about twice, 3 times a month across a busy road. I would have this thing set up across the road as kind of a treat system. Come over here and get what you need. And also as a good way to deposit in different parts of different paddocks, so that we're not kind of running over the same land. As Steve alluded to earlier, trees would just get compacted over and over and over. So you can quite literally see where they were a month before or 60 days before, what have you, and avoid that specific spot. All in all, this thing was fantastic to work with. It is definitely not an easy option. It's expensive. There's two different sizes. This was the larger size. I think it accommodates 45 cows, if I remember. The smaller one is something like 25 cows. Yeah, all in all, just a really cool device. And then I think I have another slide in here. This was just kind of something else. I have a background in carpentry, so I just love tinkering with projects. This was kind of an experiment to tow behind our existing layer house. I kind of wanted to get the chickens out from underneath the house as their only real shade option. So I built this with an existing hoop house, propped it up in a frame, put coat it behind that house, threw on the silage sheet there that you can see. And this became kind of where I fed them, where I watered them, where they got shade. The livestock guardian dogs would hang out in here when it got hot. I put some caster wheels on there, and I was a little nervous that with the caster wheels that it wouldn't handle the fields very well, but it stood the test of time and was an easy breakdown and setup for me to be able to move the chickens more frequently, because it's a farming, as it often is a one-man show. So I wanted to kind of streamline things and make it as efficient as possible. So chickens loved it, dogs loved it, geese loved it, and I loved it. Kind of worked.
Cool. Great. Thanks. All right. We'll pass it to Phelan here.
All right. Yeah, so like I was saying, we are out in the Champlain Islands in the middle of Lake Champlain. Got some pictures here of our mobile infrastructure for our laying hens. And I should say, you can see in the picture on the right with our fields, we have no tree cover pretty much in our actual pastures. We've got a couple strips, excuse me, of early successional growth. And then we do have a nice developed sugar bush, but we don't run animals in that just to preserve the ecology. So we found that these structures for our hens have worked pretty well for us. They're from a company, Hen Gear. They're about 20 by 48. We have 2 that we run just about 2,100 birds in. Yeah, they're a little bit like I like to think of them as oil tankers in the field in a way. If you want to move at a sharper angle or in a certain direction, you got to think about it a few days before you actually get to that movement point and kind of adjust, where the houses are. As you can also see in the picture of the right, there is a lot of bracing. One thing that we did this past year is we were able to remove both the vertical and horizontal braces, and added a little bit of structure in the corners, and that has made working in them tremendously easier. Those horizontal braces at the bottom are right at shin height, and we use a number of, each house has about 16 50-pound cull tube feeders, and so not having to, that at the moment we're filling with 5-gallon buckets, and so getting rid of those horizontal braces I think have made everyone much happier to work out there with egg collecting and feeding and all of that. There is a 80% shade cloth that's on top of them, as you can see in the picture on the left. This year, we are working to expand that coverage through an outrigger system on the layer houses that'll extend shade potentially up to 14 feet. And then we're also looking at adding some misters under those as well, just to keep those birds really comfortable. I tend to think about our production with our chickens the way you would maybe think about it with dairy, and that, every little stressor, every little event, you're going to see that impact in your production about 2 days later, 2 or 3 days later. So as we get into these hotter spells and more volatile weather patterns, we're just trying to maximize shade and spread those birds out so that they can stay nice and cool and they can keep their egg production up. And we're moving those. We previously had moved them every day, but we've changed up our management and now use enough poultry netting that we move them about 3 times a week, and are setting up new netting once a week, and they move into these different sections of netting. And then we've also got hogs, and so hogs don't sweat, as some of you may know, and so that presents some particular challenges. Here you can see some design that we borrowed from previous farmers that we'd worked with or other operations we'd worked on. They've gone through a couple different iterations. They've been blown over, they've been knocked over. I am not like Tyler, do not have a background in carpentry, and usually my approach is just throw a few more screws into it and see what happens. And so that's kind of what's been going on with these structures. But they work relatively well. You can see we've got some larger market hogs on the left. We could usually house about 14 in one of those comfortably. And then on the right side, those are some weaned pigs in an impact area, just as they're getting trained to the electric fence. So we keep those structures super mobile to try and cut down on compaction. We move them pretty frequently. I'd say more so than we do with the chicken houses, just because the pigs can really compact our soil, and we would see direct losses in productivity of the forage. Then we have since converted all of them to having tin roofs, gotten rid of the tarp. The tarp was, a short temporary stay, and I think everyone got tired of retying it down or looking across and just seeing a giant sail flapping. So we're all tin now.
Well, great. And I'll just round out a little more detail about our farm and work with sheep. When we started, we were all open pasture. We since added on about 10 acres. So we graze leased and owned land around 30 acres, 35 acres in total. And it's getting close to 50-50 of a really kind of marginal woodlands and then open pasture. And so our goal has been, and one of the reasons we stuck forest in our name is we really want to be reforesting, thinking about how trees, how healthy forests can succeed in the areas that are dominant with woody brush, and then how we can also bring trees into pasture. So there's been a lot of trial and error and thinning and opening things up and learning certainly along the way. And our response is always to get the feedback from the animals first and foremost. So here's a row of black locust that we planted in 2014. Wonderful species for a lot of reasons that we can get into. Fast growing, easy to work with, and the grazing impact of the animal can actually just maintain it from spreading, which is sometimes a concern. But it's a phenomenal, in addition to sort of being shade and shelter, it's a phenomenal fodder for the animals as well. Nutritional comparisons could be drawn between the leaf material of locust and like alfalfa. So it's actually, if you eat too much of it, it can be an issue. And that's where sometimes people see reports of toxicity, but really it's a question of a balanced diet. It's not something our animals are eating all the time in excess. So adding trees has been great for us. I think silvopasture as a practice kind of came onto our radar in 2016 when we had historic drought here in central New York. And we really had just gotten into grazing. We were just a few years in, at least with sheep on this land. I'd been grazing other spaces for many years, but we did this nice grazing plan, had it all kind of figured out in terms of our rotation and the paddock sizes. And then Mother Nature had other plans that year. So we did our first rotation around our nice open pastures, and then it just dried out, got hot. And, when we came around to paddock 1, there was nothing there for the animals to eat. So it kind of was, the necessity of that season that led us to pay more attention to those marginal edges of the landscape. And when we actually added up the acreage on Google Earth and looked at these areas that we had just ignored because they were mostly thick, brushy, overgrown, impenetrable, no one had probably been in there in a few decades, it was 20% of our land base was in these areas. And so that first year was an experiment of, okay, let's put the animals in. We had a breed of sheep that was really amenable to browsing on woody forage, katahdins. We'll have a really balanced preference for woodies as well as pasture grasses and legumes, and just sort of had this aha moment where we realized the ecosystem had all the things the animals wanted. In addition to being a viable food source in a very dry time, it was also shade and shelter, and that was particularly important in that year when the temperatures just never seemed to cool down. So that's always been a motivator for us. And when we added on to the south of this map is the 10 acres we added on, which is mostly overgrown, kind of brushy, marginal woods that is just the habit of much of the landscape, and especially in the Northeast, with sort of abandoned farmland that's kind of reverted back. And we found that slowly manipulating, opening these spaces over time is beneficial for the forest habitat as well as for our grazing animals. So that's all well and good where we have it. We still have plenty of open pasture, bringing trees in. The leased land, we're not really actively planting a lot of trees in. So we've also played with our sort of versions of portable shelters over time. And I think I made 3 versions of like a homemade shelter, and probably could have used some of the experience of these other 2 panelists who shared, because our general attempts were, yeah, that worked for a while, but then it just kind of started breaking the second time we tried to pull it through tall grass, or a lot of our terrain's really bumpy and has some kind of weird legacy ruts from old farming practices and things. And so dragging these things that we made on wheels around often didn't last very long, and actually ended up, costing a fair amount, maybe $500-600 a piece. And it also creates kind of a, intense sort of impact, which can be used positively or could be detrimental to pasture. So we kind of abandoned that. And I realized after having built 3 of these and all the kind of time and energy and dollars we sunk in, that probably someone else figured out a way to manufacture something that was basically what I was after. And I visited a farm in Alabama, actually, that had these porta huts. It's a company, I believe, out of Iowa. But we found a distributor locally or sort of regionally, I guess, in the state of New York, that we were able to get these shelters. And I talked to a local welder friend of mine who looked at the design and was like, yeah, it seems like a pretty good price. It was, I think, $600 a piece. Pretty simple design. We move them with our small tractor and forks, and you can actually stack them, multiple ones on top of each other. So it makes it easy to kind of move it through. You can also put these on skids and drag them if that's what you want to do. So that's been a backup solution for us that is useful, especially in inclement weather for the sheep. They don't tend to go in unless they really need to. And if we have long stretches of open pasture, but I will say they get quite hot. They're not actually that great for animal comfort, other than maybe getting a little respite. So our goal is to eliminate the need for any of these. And back to that first photo, the edges, when we start to look at the edges, the stuff on the edges of our pasture, we're really working to integrate those into pasture so that every paddock just has access to natural shade over time. So that's kind of our long-term strategy, with these being kind of the short or interim approaches. So with that, I'm going to go back just to the front. If anyone wants to reference a photo, we can do that. But there's a sort of a start off question that I want to give to everyone, and then I want to encourage everyone in the audience to start putting questions in the Whova app. And I think the way we want to start is to hear from everybody about why shade's important to you. How do you know it's worth the investment to add shade to your grazing systems? So does anyone want to start and just kind of answer, like, in terms of like putting this energy, time, investment in? How do you know it's worth it? What do you see as those benefits that are making you put the effort in?
I think we already addressed this, Steve. Observe your animals, and again, anytime it's really gets up into the 60s, you start to see the animals moving towards shade, which is temperatures that we experience throughout the growing season. So, and it's not just our animals, we as humans do it too. I'm a forester, so I watch people out in our woods walks and such, and we usually stop in spots that are half sun and half shade, and it's fun to see people actively seek out one or the other of those, depending on whether they're warm-blooded or cold-blooded.
Yeah, for me, I think it's certainly the animal welfare, animal happiness, for lack of a better term. And then the kind of the compelling thing for me is the data that's starting to come out more, that you talked about, Steve, about, what are the financial benefits of this? I mean, what are we talking about in terms of weight gain or weight lost without these options? So I think as time goes on, that research hopefully becomes more and more kind of cemented, and I like to keep track of it, and worthwhile, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with those points made already. And definitely for us, like I was mentioning with the layers, we see repercussions in terms of our egg production within 2 to 3 days of a hot spell. And with our pigs, I realized one other thing I forgot to mention, another style of portable shade we use. We rely heavily on wallows, so mud pits for our pigs, and we're working to take a different approach with those. They can be a tricky beast to manage. You're basically destroying a part of your pasture, creating a pit, adding moisture to it so the pigs can coat themselves, and then you're creating this heavily nutrient-laden zone. And what we're trying and starting to do is we've started reorienting our farm to have more of a keyline design pattern, following some of the work of P.A. Yeoman, and trying to put these wallows in spots of our fields where we would eventually be able to lift a gate or some sort of dam breach on these wallows and drain that nutrient-rich water onto the fields, providing some fertility boost. But we also find that allowing those pigs to wallow, they're basically carrying shade with themselves. We'll see animals grazing, and we graze a little bit differently with our pigs. We move pigs at least once a day, depending on forage growth. We'll even, with spring flush and fall flush, be moving them multiple times a day with a single strand of polywire, and trying to have more of a central impact zone that we're then radiating out from there. And if those pigs are getting into those wallows and getting covered in mud, they're going to be able to graze a lot longer. they're still not going to be grazing at the height of the day. They're all going to be snoozing in the sun or in the shade structures or in the wallow. But you'll see pigs that are just completely covered in mud, and they'll be, 150, 250 feet out if we've gotten that far with the fence, and they're actively grazing, and then they'll cruise back to cool off and go back again. So we see a lot more forage utilization, more of an even graze, and that, kind of in turn even results in less of a rooting issue for us if we can keep them comfortable, because they're not trying to root down into that soil and find a cooler spot to get to.
Thanks, guys. So building off that, there's a question from the audience, and we should get a little more specific, I think, generally with costs. So the question or the comment is, I've heard it often argued that if you need shade for your livestock, then you're using the wrong genetics. What's your response to this assertion? And can you make a business case for providing shade? So just getting a sense of what costs you associate with these different strategies, and when it feels like it's paying off, and what that looks like from your perspective. Brett, you want to start?
I think it's important to always pay attention to costs, but what price can you put on animal comfort and welfare? And as Phelan and Tyler have already pointed out, some of these impacts are easy to measure and some are very, I would say, like insidious. So we raise beef cattle, and yes, we should always be thinking about biotypes that can adapt to our conditions on our farms. Is it cheaper to maybe call out the few animals that can't deal with the heat stress, or invest a lot of money and time in providing more shade? That's an interesting question, but if I'm uncomfortable, I'm going to try and make myself more comfortable. So if I'm locking my animals in a paddock and they're uncomfortable, then I think I have a moral obligation, business decisions aside, to try to make them more comfortable. And shade is the easy way to do that. And shade, I think this is one of your other questions, Steve, that we may get to yet, but there's plenty of other advantages beyond just animal comfort, and perhaps production maintenance or increases from providing shade. I'm going to let Tyler and Phelan comment on that question.
I would pretty much agree with that. I think that it probably is something that's very farmer specific. So that question could be answered very differently depending on what the goals of the farm is. I mean, is it just providing meat for your family? We're talking a major feedlot? There's lots of different variables that I think you could justify looking at it different ways. So what Brett said to me, anyway, personally, I think animal welfare was always at the top of the list, and balancing that with a business mindset. Certainly, you can look at it different ways. So I don't have a great answer other than, I think it's, like I said, it's very farmer specific.
Yeah, being on the tail end of Tyler and Brett saying stuff, I would agree with both of them as well. We're all in this to grazing livestock is such a responsibility, and working with livestock is such a responsibility. So making sure that they are comfortable, that we're comfortable to be able to work with them is pretty paramount. I think there's definitely advantages in the long term to working through your genetics and seeing what works on your farm, what doesn't work on your farm, and calling on that basis. But I do think that there's absolutely an emotional value and a welfare value to making sure your animals are comfortable through shade or whatever you're able to do, misters or anything like that. But there is, yeah, I think it's pretty easy to tie it back into an economic decision as well, where you just can see improved gains and improved production metrics as well.
And
When you had oh, go ahead. Brett.
our animals already have to deal with a lot of stress factors that we really can't do anything about. So heat stress seems like a pretty easy one to address for many of us most of the time. Move them to shade. And if that shade is relatively already there and relatively inexpensive, like this photo of where we're just using our naturally existing trees, then why not? You still have to follow all the tenets of good rotational grazing and not overstress your trees. But if we have to make big investments in shade, then we need to look at that from a business perspective a little more closely. But I feel shade is extremely important in many ways to the animals, and I maybe am not going to build $100,000 Taj Mahal pole barn just to give them shade part of the time, which I think that would be a bad idea anyhow. But any little thing I can do to create shade it's going to happen.
And I think I'd love to dig in. So Phelan, you mentioned specifically seeing a difference in egg production with access to shade versus not. Can you just tell a little bit more about that, what that looked like? And because that seems like a good compelling example. And then Brett, I want you to address you've thought before about the cost of like building a barn versus these living barns, just to kind of think about those, because I think those are good direct examples about cost. So Phelan, you want to talk about the eggs first?
Yeah, absolutely. So we one of the metrics we track on the farm is every time we bring eggs in from the field, we track how many flats we've gotten. We keep track of the number of birds that we have based off of mortalities. And then once a week, do a averaging of those against each other, just to give us some really basic production information. We get our birds in the spring, and usually about June or July, we're reaching peak lay. And these are all production hybrid brown egg layers, high lines. And so usually about that time, we're approaching 92% lay. So of that, 2,100 birds, 92% we're collecting an egg from every day for the week. And we've had instances of, you get into July and stretches of 90 degrees. And if those, a week-long stretch of 90 degrees, if those birds aren't comfortable, they're not going to be eating. They're not going to be meeting they'll be eating to meet their energy needs, but not their protein needs. And they're also just going to be stressed. So you'll go in, you'll see them, they're open mouth panting, everyone's got their wings up. And there's just a lot of stress to them. And with those houses too, they end up all clustering under. And so they've got that additional stress of just being too close to each other, and you'll start seeing some pecking. So we've seen drops, sometimes we'll see drops from 92% down to 86% lay, which usually we can get bounced back up. But occasionally you can't. And then you're now stuck at an 86, 85% lay, which over a week and over sending eggs out with our wholesale accounts does add up pretty quick. Pastured eggs, just from a labor standpoint, are always such a tight margin that for us, we really have to focus on maximizing production along with keeping the animals comfortable. And so even dropping into that lower percentage early in the season and the threat of it not bouncing back can really make a different economic picture for us. They're just, birds are a bit like, at least egg laying birds are a bit like dairy cattle. And it's, if you have less milk in your bulk tank or less eggs in your cartons, it just cuts into your overall profitability pretty quick. So that's a pretty direct one for us there. And we've seen it a little bit too with the pigs as well, especially as we're starting to farrow more. We've had not too many litters, but if they're carrying through a heavier heat load or something like that, you can have some fetal mortality. That at the end, when you're trying to get some sort of profit off of selling piglets, selling weaner pigs, if you have smaller litters, if you're weaning 5 to 6 per sow instead of weaning 8 or 9, that also cuts in pretty quick.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Brett, do you want to talk how you think economically about living barns versus pole barns?
Well, the fundamental difference is that our living barn there is an appreciating asset, and any type of roof shelter that we would build would be the opposite of that. But 2018, the second half of it at least, was as close as we've ever come to feeling that maybe we just needed to have a bit more roof shelter on our old dairy farm. We have 2 old dairy barns on the farm. They're totally impractical for winter shelters. We overwinter close to 200 head of cattle in a typical winter on our farm. And if you use the very minimum rules of thumbs for how many square feet you would need per animal, even as temporary shelter, and what today's costs are per square foot, that would have been at least a $250,000 investment to provide some emergency shelter for our animals. I think that these fairly dense mixed conifer plantations, in that picture there, you can only see Norway spruce, but we have large white pine, ponderosa pine, concolor fir, bunch of different coniferous species. We still have to manage these and thin them out so that we can maintain vigorous growth of the trees. But again, as I said earlier, we're not trying to thin them out really to get enough sunlight on the ground to grow productive forages. We have 6 of these living barn areas scattered around the farm. These are old plantations that we were planting in the 80s, and we use them strategically. We stock them with some extra hay and watch the 10-day forecast. And if we see the nasty winter weather's coming like we had this year just prior to Christmas, then we move them in those directions for a few days. And I know a frequently asked question about this is, what do you do for water? In this case, it's a stream, it's groundwater, but we have energy-free waters on the farm too. You have to have water.
Great, and I'll add, just from the sheep perspective, we definitely, in terms of the genetics, we definitely factored that question in when we chose Katahdin. Katahdin are a relatively recent cross between St. Croix, which are sheep native to the Caribbean islands, and Suffolk and other sort of cold hardy breeds. And the goal was to find a cross that was sort of tolerant of the wide range of temperature ranges that a sort of temperate farm might experience. They're a hair sheep, so they naturally put on a thicker coat in the winter and then shed that in the summer. And that was also an economic decision, because as we thought about our goals for production, wool was not one of them. And what we learned from other sheep raisers is, if you're not going to be a passionate fiber person, then it's just extra cost and stress for everyone involved to have to shear. And then that plus the sort of wide palette of foraging, I think that's a really important one if you're interested in working with silvopasture and sort of tree-based systems. Animals that have a history and experience from a breed perspective can be really beneficial, but also sort of a cultural perspective. So you can have animals that are used to just being in less of a rotation system, fed out supplements, not foraging for their own diet and learning that in the landscape. And those qualities and characteristics are potentially genetic, but they're also learned within the culture of the group. And I would encourage folks, if they haven't come across Fred Provenza's work around the sort of nutritional and self-regulating wisdom of livestock. Fred has behind him several decades of research to show how these factors play out in animal preference and animal comfort, and so these characteristics of browsing and grazing seeking out food in the landscape are actually passed from mother to offspring. That's been shown through research. So I think that dynamic is a really important one to pay attention to. And we selected this breed also because we had friends and neighbors around who were also raising it. So we were in close proximity to be able to find new rams and find, and troubleshoot with others and that sort of thing. So, so those are kind of all the factors that went in when we thought about it. We're gonna talk a little. We'll dive a little bit specifically into a couple silvopasture questions. So Brett, I'll start with you. And a really popular question on the Hoover board is recommended species for planting into pasture. So you want to share a few of your favorites?
I'll make a general statement first. If you're going to plant trees, mix it up, plant diversity of species. As an extension forester, people often come to me with their planting projects, their kind of dream species, whether it's going to be chestnuts or walnuts or something, fruit trees. And from personal experience, 35 years of planting trees into pasture environments, I'll say that you don't know what the next big pest is going to be. So, and there's already a lot of pests out there. 30 some years ago, we were planting probably over 30 different tree species here on our farm, and today less than half of those species are still growing here because of pests that weren't on the radar when that happened. So you also, of course, need to make sure you're planting the right tree for the given site. Not all trees do equally well on, say, low seasonally wet clay soils versus well-drained or maybe excessively drained sandy or gravelly soils. So know what the silvics are of the species and plant trees that have a purpose, ideally. So it doesn't necessarily just have to be a high value timber tree or a tree that produces some high value mass crop. Every tree I think has value and every tree has a purpose, but so diversity of species, right tree for the right site, and trees that are giving you multiple benefits. Specific species, we have many dozens of different species that I think can be feasibly planted into pasture environments. So I'll come back to species but I want to keep time for other questions.
Sure. Phelan or Tyler, are you doing any tree planting or have you done any past? Any thoughts on this question? Or
we're part of a agricultural cooperative that is working to build out our landscapes, like I was mentioning, on a keyline pattern along with some other processes. And so we're starting to work with Megan Giroux of Interlaced Agroforestry Commons to lay out species on our a few agroforestry techniques on our property that encompasses some silvopastoral aspects, some potential timber harvesting down the road. But we're not actively doing anything at the moment besides planting a few apple trees in our own yard for eating.
Cool. Yeah, I'll just add on to what Brett said, and I think there's a big fork in the road with tree planting and pasture of these sort of tree crops versus multifunctional trees that we often are putting a lot of trees in the pasture for the shade, shelter, and fodder benefits to livestock. And we're particularly interested, at least in the shorter term, of things that will grow above browse height and whose bark will harden off sufficiently so that we can get the sheep back in with them like ASAP. Because every time you plant a tree and have to exclude animals from it, then there's extra management to keep the competitive grasses down, to mulch, to do whatever else. And so that kind of that starts to limit the list a bit because of what will grow in 3-4 seasons and get to those kind of qualities. And we've tried a lot of things, and I think a key thing to know is if you're going to plant trees, you're also going to kill a lot of trees. It's just part of the process. And I think a big mistake folks make is often thinking every seedling they plant is going to survive. That's not how Mother Nature plants trees. The general strategy is plant a lot, and most of them don't make it to mature size. So we like to plant densely, knowing that we'll either be thinning or there'll be natural processes for thinning. If folks are interested, particularly in the fodder stuff, if you go to our silvopasturebook.com website, there's some resources there about tree fodder. And our farm did a Northeast SARE grant where we actually took forage analysis of 6 tree species, 3 that we planted and 3 that were sort of naturalized on the landscape, including some popular invasive, so-called invasive species. And it was interesting to do that analysis and see that from that perspective, pretty much every woody species has value, has nutritional value, and they all carry different qualities in that. So the whole kind of research report and some other resources can be found there if you're interested in learning more about that fodder aspect. But some of our favorites that we come back to a lot are black locust, poplars, different willows. There's 400 different species of willow. Someone asked about intersecting the benefits of trees with pollinator or wildlife habitat, and willows, I think one that's often overlooked. It's a really easy tree for farmers to get going and have some quick shade from. There's a lot of different varieties to choose from. You probably have some on the landscape already that you can, it's one of the only trees you can take a cutting of and stick it in some loose soil and start to grow a tree, which is nice. So that can be some low-hanging fruit to play with, and there's lots of avenues to pursue from there, and it also has some nutritional benefit to the animals as well. So we'll leave that there for now, though. Brett, I'm gonna ask one more silvopasture question, which came in and had some interest, which was about how I'm trying to find the exact question. How are we? It's about thinning essentially. So where did it go? I had it right here. Sorry about that. I'm going to find the exact question, but I guess we'll actually go back to movable shelters for a second. So folks are definitely interested in costs associated with the constructed shelters or the shade haven. So I don't know if Tyler and Phelan, you can speak to what you know about costs for those different examples you showed.
Yeah, sure. So the shade havens, I don't remember off the top of my head, to be honest. I know that there is fairly significant grant money to reduce these costs that are out there, but I think it was in the range of 20,000 and up for the larger structure. A lot of that is, these are all custom built per order, so I think a lot of that is built into that, not to mention the engineering. Kind of on the more made, DIY adventures, I would say I'm kind of under the belief that overbuild it, because you're really gonna beat it up. So protect the frame at all costs. That's the big reason I put those things, that what you're looking at right now on casters, is if it failed, I wanted the casters to fail. The structure itself was certainly way over improved, but we're dealing with heavy winds, so I needed to be heavy, dealing with moving it every day, every other day. So it's going to take a lot of racking back and forth. So costs certainly, I think that might have take out the hoop house, and I think that was somewhere in the range of $800 all said and done, with the nipple water system and the PEX and the troughs and all the lumber and whatnot. Probably could have done it for half of that, but I don't think it would have lasted more than maybe a year or two, and then you're doing it all over again.
And there's a couple questions around, can you just speak to any like challenges working with these shade havens? You mentioned a lot of the benefits. Are there anything folks should know about?
Yeah, the biggest one is certainly protecting against wind, and being on the South Coast, that was a real concern. They can handle steady 35-mile-an-hour winds, gusts about 55. Honestly, this year I pulled it at one time though for those concerns, which I was actually quite surprised about. I didn't see them kind of tipping at all. I mean, I didn't even come close to seeing that be a concern. And I'm parking on slopes of steep slopes anyway. I can't think of what the grade is, but that, and you know, the cows love to drop their manure on it, so you just physically always getting involved in that. But I mean, that's just a daily habit of farming, right? So I really don't have a lot to complain about with that specific piece. It was really a phenomenal piece of engineering, and I would recommend it for anyone who ever, you know, if that's within the parameters of what you can do. It's kind of a no-brainer for me.
All right, so Phelan, any thoughts on costs?
Yeah, so like I said, these the skiddable chicken houses are from Hen Gear. We bought them, I think they were 10,000 each, and they come, you have to build them yourself. First one I did mostly by myself, and besides putting the plastic on and a few portions, and I don't know the hours specifically on that, but I know the second one I think we put up in 2 days and probably could have done in a day if we hadn't had other chores. But we've had one since 2017 and one since 2018. Really the only cost we're going to have in addition is the older one probably needs new plastic within the next 2 years, which will probably be about $3,000 to $5,000. And I think if we were probably actively pulling the shade cloth on and off, we'd extend that life a little bit. It just, the way the wiggle wire tracks for the plastic and the shade works, you just get just like a mold build up in there at times, and it just degrades the plastic a little bit. I think they're great. I also I often would rather pay someone else to do something that I wouldn't be that skilled at. And so for us, these chicken houses were worth every penny because we would have never been able to build anything like that. And we can move them around. We can house all of our food, water, and egg laying boxes in there. And then with the pig houses, I think probably the tin was the most expensive part. I unfortunately don't have a good number on the lumber. Just because a lot of it, like I think those are 8x8s on the bottom. We just happened to find a pile in the woods from a previous farmer, and there were some that were good and some that weren't. So we were able to use those. And another thing we've used for pigs, which are great, is at least I'm sure a lot of us experience this. A lot of dairy farms are unfortunately going out of business, or other farms are going out of business, and we've gotten a number of 6 to 14-ton grain bins that maybe the cone rotted out on, and with a grinder and some time, you can make those into pretty nice structures reminiscent of those porta huts that you had, Steve. We usually run them without a back on them for airflow, and those work pretty well. We don't really have a consolidated system for those. I think the downside for that is, again, labor of just when you want to move pasture or move infrastructure, you end up moving 5 different pieces of equipment. And so that's really an advantage with those Hen Gear hoops, is you can do one pull with a tractor and move all of your infrastructure in about, depending on how far you want to go, 5 minutes or so, as opposed to 20 to 30 minutes and fuel of the tractor with multiple pieces of infrastructure.
Cool. Great. So we're gonna, I found my question I had lost, and I'm gonna toss it to Brett to finish us off here. We talked a little about putting trees in pasture, but if we're looking at sort of converting woodlands, the question is how you manage the shade of the trees so it doesn't decrease the growth of grasses, or how do you maintain forage quality in those woodland conversion silvopastures?
Fortunately, many of our cool season grasses grow quite well under light shade. So And if you look carefully at this picture here, you notice that all the trees that are left are what we would think of as like nice trees. They're basically saw timber quality trees. And what's missing are the equal or greater number of trees that were mixed in with these better saw timber quality trees that we would think of as firewood or pulpwood quality trees. So I think of silval pasturing as a choice of, do I want to grow firewood in my woods, or do I want to remove that firewood and reallocate that sunlight from the upper canopy to the ground where I can grow forages, productive forages instead. And the density of trees, that's where I'll leave it today, is just call it density of trees, because if we start talking about from a forestry perspective, it gets messy, is going to be similar for growing good forages in a silval pasture as if we were just trying to grow healthy, productive, the best trees that we have in a given acre of our woods. So I'm not going to give you specific numbers. Foresters know how to do this in their sleep. Work with a forester, a consulting forester, an extension forester, a state forester, an RCS forester, soil and water forester. There's plenty of forester resources out there to help you get the balance right between having a kind of a fully stocked site with good trees versus having enough sunlight there to grow productive cool season forages.
Great. Well, I want to thank all the panelists for chiming in. It, I think, gave everybody a nice buffet of options and lots to think about and sort of weighing the pros and cons of all these things. So thanks, everybody. And thanks for attending, everyone in the audience.
Yeah, thank you all. And for any of you who didn't get your questions asked, please check back at the Q&A, or you can also direct message the speakers. I know that there were some questions out there that were very specific to certain speakers. So feel free to direct message them. You can do that through the Whova and find their attendee. They'll be in the attendees area of Whova. And again, this stuff will stay live for 3 months, so you got some time. And I would want to draw your attention to the next session. So the implications of improving your biodiversity, the biodiversity of your forage, with Heather Darby and friends, is coming up at 1 o'clock. So we'll see you there. And yeah, thank you very much to all the panelists who shared their knowledge today. We really appreciate it.
I'm going to have a bio lunch and I'll look at those questions and answer any that look like they were for me. So
Awesome. Thanks.